Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to do a presentation on Jean-Eugène Robert-Houdin. If you've been in magic for 20 minutes, you've probably heard of Robert-Houdin. He is considered to be the father of modern conjuring. The father of modern conjuring. Now, when you first get involved in magic, this is what you're told. This man pioneered modern magic. He took magic out of the fairgrounds and he put it in the legitimate theater. He took magic out of the lower classes and presented it to the upper classes. He stopped presenting magic as a form of black magic or as something real, and he presented it as a theatrical performance. He wore evening attire. You'll hear all of these things about Robert-Houdin. You'll also hear about his inventions. He was a clockmaker. He made the most wonderful automata. He made things that we still marvel at today. You're going to hear all these things about Jean-Eugène Robert-Houdin. But as you advance in magic, as you begin to read more about this person, you find out that many of these things that are attributed to him aren't exactly authentic. Or maybe they're exaggerated, or maybe they're just completely false. Another great legend about Jean-Eugène Robert-Houdin is that he saved France from war. He went and he presented the light-heavy chest, and he presented the bullet catch, and he convinced these people that the French had greater magicians, and so they revered him. That's probably false as well. So Louis Rivera, a viewer here on this channel, asked me to do a presentation on Jean-Eugène Robert-Houdin. And I have long wanted to do it. I really have. I've long wanted to do it, but my feelings are mixed. My feelings are mixed about this character. I think one of the things he does represent is the tendency of some performers and some within our art to exaggerate or to feed a narrative to the press that the press will pick up on, because, you know, the press wants a sensational story. We like to believe that the press is ethical in their presentation of news, but the reality is, and has been for centuries, that the press is more concerned with sensation than they are with truth. So it becomes fairly easy for in my opinion, an unethical person to feed a false narrative to the press, and the press not checking, not doing their due diligence, just receiving a sensational story and having a source, will go ahead and run with the story. And so we've seen this throughout the history of our art, and that to me is a violation of my own personal ethical standards. Now we can certainly debate this. I think it's worth having a discussion about, because I've been told by some other people that you need to self-promote, and you certainly do, and that it doesn't matter what you actually do. What really matters is what people think you do. And that is somewhat controlled by publicity narratives. You know, if you look at many of the greats throughout the course of our history, greats being great magicians, many of them actually engaged in that kind of publicity seeking, and they did so successfully. I'm a mentalist, and when I present mentalism, I present it as a form of magic, and so people understand that I'm doing magic. I'm a conjurer. I'm doing tricks to. I like the quote that goes something like this: "A magician is an honest liar. He tells his audience that he's going to deceive them, and then he does." and everyone enjoys it. I think that's really where I'm coming from as an entertainer and as a mentalist. I value truth, I value honesty, and I value it in my personal life, and I value it in my professional life. And so I have mixed emotions about presenting on Robert-Houdin. On the one hand, I cannot deny the force of Robert-Houdin's personality and the force of his historical significance to our art. On the other hand, I have a tendency to want to sift out the myth from the truth and present more of what Robert-Houdin actually was, as opposed to the myth. The same can be said of Houdini. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment, because Houdini revered Robert-Houdin the way many of us growing up revered Houdini. But when Houdini investigated the history of his idol, and I'm going to read to you the first couple of pages from Houdini's book so you can see the hurt and experience what he experienced. It was a completely disillusioned experiencing for him when he actually learned the truth about Robert-Houdin. And this is the problem with building castles on sand, if you will. When you do find out the truth, it can be very disheartening. So I'd rather just present the truth straight up than have to deal with that. Now I have notes. I'm going to share some notes with you, and then I'm going to get into the books and talk about that. But Luis Rivera, you asked for this. I hope you enjoy it. I hope it's something that hits the mark for you. Jean Robert-Houdin was born December 7th, 1805, and he passed away or crossed over June 13th, 1871. It is incorrect to refer to Jean-Eugène Robert-Houdin as Hudan. His last name is actually Robert-Houdin. His birth name was Jean-Eugène Robert. He married Joseph Cecile Hudan, and under special dispensation from the French government was allowed to use the hyphenated last name. That's kind of unusual, but he did, and I mean, it stands the test of time. Robert-Houdin is who we know. He is the sacred cow of magic, in my opinion. The sacred cow of magic. He is known as the father of modern conjuring. And what we're told is that before Jean-Eugène Robert-Houdin, before him, magicians performed at fairs and Renaissance festivals, if you will, that kind of thing, that open market. They performed on the street. They were buskers. After Robert-Houdin came along, magic became a legitimate art form, and it was performed in legitimate theaters. In fact, Robert-Houdin had his own theater, operated his own theater. So there's much to be said for his contribution. There's also much made of his automata, in his use of automata in his act. But I am going to do a presentation on Isaac Fawkes. If I have not posted that already, I will be doing that shortly. Isaac Fawkes was born in 1675. He crossed over May 25th, 1732. Roughly 100 years before Robert-Houdin. Isaac Fawkes dressed in the appropriate clothing of his period. He did not wear the garbs of the wizard. He also performed automata. He also combined the performance of automata with sleight of hand, and he also performed in legitimate theaters for the upper classes. So to say that Robert-Houdin was the first, no, he was not the first, even at that. Jim Steinmeyer, the author of The Secret History of Magic, I've often presented that book on this forum as the definitive history, and I'd encourage you to read it. Jim Steinmeyer said of Robert-Houdin, Robert-Houdin was something that a magician had never been before. He was a writer. insinuating, of course, and in the book, The Secret History of Magic, Jim Steinmeyer, within the course of maybe 15 pages, completely dismantles the myth of Jean-Eugène Robert-Houdin. And so it's one of the reasons I like the book so much. It's a book that deals with fact rather than fiction. Wikipedia, if you Google Robert-Houdin, one of the first things you'll get is the Wikipedia article. And I'm quoting here from that article. His writings were meant more to entertain than to chronicle, rendering it difficult to separate fact from fiction. And that's really the problem. I don't want to take anything away from him that he deserves to have. At the same time, I'm not comfortable crediting him with things that he doesn't deserve to be credited with. And so that's the dilemma that anyone who's dealing with the subject matter of Robert-Houdin has to grapple with. Robert-Houdin wrote his memoirs. At least theoretically, he wrote his memoirs. I'm going to deal with that in a moment. It's quite a lengthy book. It's still available. You can get it if you want. It was the memoirs that inspired so many people, including Houdini. It was the memoirs from which we derive all of the things that we ascribe to Robert-Houdin. It's this book that created the reputation, the Memoirs of Robert-Houdin. Now, Houdini read this book and was inspired to become a magician because of this book and because of the role model of Robert-Houdin. It inspired him to do great things. In that respect, I think Robert-Houdin deserves some credit. But let me read for you now. This is the book called The Unmasking of Robert-Houdin by Harry Houdini. It was written in 1909. And what I'd like to do is read to you the first 2 pages. And I'm reading this. This is in the introduction. I'm reading this because it tells the story better than I can in the words of Harry Houdini, who idolized Robert-Houdin, looked up to Robert-Houdin, modeled himself after Robert-Houdin. So here you go. This book is the natural result of the molding, dominating influence which the spirit and writings of Robert-Houdin have exerted over my professional career. My interest in conjuring and magic and my enthusiasm for Robert-Houdin came into existence simultaneously. From the moment that I began to study the art, he became my guide and hero. I accepted his writings as my textbook and my gospel. What Blackstone is to the struggling lawyer, Houdin's tactics to the would-be officer, or Bismarck's life and writings to the coming statesman, Robert-Houdin's books were to me. To my unsophisticated mind, his memoirs gave to the profession a dignity worth attaining at a cost of earnest, lifelong effort. When it became necessary for me to take a stage name, and a fellow player possessing a veneer of culture told me that if I would add the letter I to Houdin's name, it would mean in the French language, like Hudan. I adopted the suggestion with enthusiasm. I asked nothing more of life than to become in my profession like Robert-Houdin. By this time I had reread his works until I could recite passage after passage from memory. Then, when fate turned kind and the golden pathway of success led me into broader avenues of work, I determined that my first tour abroad should be dedicated to adding new laurels to the fame of Robert-Houdin. By research and study, I would unearth history yet unwritten and record unsung triumphs of this great inventor and artist. The pen of his most devoted student and follower would awaken new interest in his history. Alas, for my golden dreams. My investigations brought forth only bitterest disappointment and saddest of disillusionment. Stripped of his self-woven veil of romance, Robert-Houdin stood forth in the uncompromising light of cold historical facts, a mere pretender. A man who waxed great on the brainwork of others. A mechanician who had boldly filched the inventions of the master craftsman among his predecessors. Memoirs of Robert-Houdin, ambassador, author, and conjurer, written by himself, proved to have been the pen work of a brilliant Parisian journalist employed by Robert-Houdin to write his so-called autobiography. So there you have it. And you know what? Houdini would go on to some legend himself, and there are things about Houdini's life that if you really do the research, you find out that they just didn't happen. I won't go into all the details on Houdini. This isn't about Houdini, but I find it a little bit ironic that Houdini would become so disillusioned and so disappointed that he would write a book on the subject and then turn around and do virtually the same thing. Now we owe a great deal to these men, both of them, to Robert-Houdin for giving us the inspiration, and to Harry Houdini for the same purpose, for the same reason. But no biography or presentation on Robert-Houdin, in my opinion, would be complete without this discussion, and that's why I'm doing it. If you want to see what Robert-Houdin might have been like as a performer, check this out. It's called The Illusionist, and it stars Edward Norton and Jessica Biel. It is a lovely film. I love the way it's photographed. I love the effects in it. Many of the effects that are portrayed in the film are ascribed to or attributed to Robert-Houdin, and I think that it's presented. It's the same period, so I think that Robert-Houdin was definitely the inspiration for this movie. Check it out. You won't be the film's great, by the way. It's just great, but you do get to see some of the things that you read about. You know, the blooming orange tree, the light heavy chest, but done as a sword instead of a chest. You get to see all of that, and really the wonder of Victorian theater at the time. So it's just a great movie. Check it out. On July 3rd, 1845, Robert-Houdin premiered his 200-seat theater. Robert-Houdin said that the first show he did, was a disaster. Now, this is coming from his memoirs, okay? He said it was a disaster because he suffered from severe stage fright, which caused him to talk too fast and in a monotone. I can tell you from experience that when stage fright is overwhelming, you will rush. You will go faster than you should, and you won't. Your voice will not inflect the way it should if you're presenting in a comfortable manner. But over time, he overcame his stage fright. He became better, and this became a wonderful theater experience. He premiered a second sight. He wasn't the inventor of the second sight act, but many will say that he honed the second sight act to perfection. He did it with his son. His son, he would go out, Robert-Houdin would go out into the audience, he would hold up objects, his son would be able to identify these objects even though he never saw them. He also invented the Ethereal Suspension, which became the broom suspension in our time. The marvelous blooming orange tree, which I alluded to earlier. Basically what would happen here is he would borrow a handkerchief and he would vanish the handkerchief. This orange tree would blossom. He could take oranges off the tree and distribute them, and then butterflies would flutter up, and the handkerchief would come up on the butterflies. It was a beautiful illusion, and that illusion is done in this film. He also invented the light heavy chest. Robert-Houdin contracted pneumonia, and on June 13th, 1871, he passed away at the age of 65. His theater was sold to Georges Méliès in 1888, who used the theater to present some of his films. So I think that's a nice little piece of history there. Now, folks, I like I said at the beginning, I was when Luis Rivera asked me to do this, I was excited and a little not excited, because I understand the importance of Robert-Houdin to our art. I understand the basic message is present magic as art, present it as legitimate theater, be as creative and original as you possibly can. That's the message of Robert-Houdin, and that message stands the test of time, whatever you might think of Robert-Houdin. Folks, thank you so much for joining me. Louis, thank you so much for asking for this. Please subscribe if you have not done so already. Please comment. I love your comments. I will see you next time. Take care.